There we go. So, and I am, well, happy to introduce Daniel, our Peoria Campus Librarian, to talk with us today on a topic called fault lines. You might wonder why sports rivalry is tied to our 2022-2023 book, Think Again by Adam Grant, but I have a feeling Daniel will probably allude to that in some way here. So we will go ahead and get started. I'll let Daniel introduce himself here.
All right, well, thank you, Amy. My name is Daniel Fuertges. I am campus librarian at ICC's Peoria campus. I'm liaison to the health careers area over there. And so, as Amy briefly mentioned, our topic today is something I call fault lines, which looks at rivalries in the context of sports. We'll also take a quick look at some other options or scenarios where you'll run into rivalries, as well as tie in why it's relevant to our selection for this week. And bear with me one moment while I get the view I need up here.
I can never remember that one either. Okay. We're still on title slide.
Sure, I lost the view I had. Bear with me here. Okay, and so for those of you online, I apologize if the audio isn't super great for this, but I just have a very brief introductory video that I think will kind of display the theme for this presentation as well.
Okay, so this is just a little exercise I like to kick off with. I want you guys to give me examples of things that Catholics and Protestants have in common and things that they don't have in common. Let's start with similarities. Erin, why don't you get the ball rolling?
Okay, so we both, right? So we all.
Anything at all, small thing.
Okay, so, right.
Not to worry. Someone else, a similarity. Yes.
Protestants are British and Catholics are Irish.
So that's actually a difference. Quite a big difference. That's okay, we can write that down. Now, back to similarities. Yes.
Protestants are richer.
Okay, so that's another difference. And I'm not sure that's actually. Is that true?
Yeah, I suppose that's fair enough.
Yes, great. Off you go.
Catholics really buzz off staff cheese and we don't so much.
I do enjoy a good statue, Esther said.
So again, what we have there is a difference.
Protestants like to march and Catholics like to walk.
Okay, can we just, Jenny, could you just, oh, you've already written it down, have you? I just want to pause and think about what's in here. The fact that we all feel and love and hope and write this down. We all cry. We all laugh. We all dream. So I just want to think along those lines for a moment.
Catholics want turkey.
Protestants love cleaner.
Catholics with more freckles.
Protestants hate
Let me just rephrase slightly. Can you think of anything that unites every single person in this room? Is there anything that we all want for this to be over? And wrap it up there.
So I think you'll see why this clip is relevant here through the course of the presentation today. And again, I apologize if the audio wasn't super great online.
Okay, so this.
So I had just a quick icebreaker here. And so if you're able to, in the chat online, you can post something there. But I asked just a few quick questions. So what are your favorite and least favorite sports teams? Why do you feel that way? And were you born into your fandom? And so Amy's here in person, so let me go ahead and ask her what her response would be while you type yours out.
Gosh. Favorite team at the moment for football would be the Minnesota Vikings. So of course, that means I'm not a great Green Bay Packer fan, but my most hated football team is actually the Dallas Cowboys. It's easier for me to come up with a least favorite than more favorite in a lot of ways, because I'm also not a fan of the New York Yankees.
Okay.
And why I feel that way for both Cowboys and the Yankees is that they are quote unquote America's team. And I'm like, no, that's not necessarily true. You might want to rethink that.
Sure.
As far as being born into my fandom, no, I would say I'm married into my fandom. Because my husband is a Vikings fan, so.
Okay, and it looks like Paula online said she loves the Cardinals. She has fond memories of watching the games and summer evenings with her father, and spent most of her youth in St. Louis and with deep roots in the area there. Brian is also a fan of the St. Louis Cardinals, and all I have to say to that is boo.
Yeah.
He says his least favorite baseball team is the Houston Astros because of the recent cheating scandal. And he was not born into the fandom. He became a fan during college because of his roommate at the time. So those are all great responses. And so just to kind of get you thinking about why you support certain teams and where those roots may lie. So where does the word arrival come from? So it has its roots in Latin, which seems to be a common thing. And there's two, so the root is actually rivus, which stands for brook or stream. And it also could have stemmed from another form of rivus, which is rivalis, which is of a brook or stream. And its origins really had its roots when you had multiple parties that were using the same stream in this instance as another individual. So you can see how over time competition may emerge from that. Throughout history, it's a relatively recent usage in English, at least. So one of the earliest references to the word rival in English is actually through Shakespeare, who in a 1632 play, Two Gentlemen of Verona, it's in the following quote: "My foolish rival that her father likes only for his possessions are so huge, is gone with her along, and I must after, for love, though knowst, is full of jealousy." So here you can see it's used in the context of competition for love interest. Actually, I have one slide out over here, so I apologize. And in 1902, James Mark Baldwin, who was a psychologist, identified three main kinds of rivalry. He indicated biological rivalry, which is through birth, and then also the personal or conscious rivalry. So that's going to be something you have a personal connection to or associate with mentally or philosophically. And then commercial or an industrial rivalry, which we see in business contexts today. But also too, it kind of bridges into the conscious rivalry too, especially like in the industrial area, which happened to coincide with a lot of organized athletic competition. You get to see some rivalries emerge from there. So essentially, when you take all these things into context, rivalry can simply be defined as different groups competing for the same resource or goal. There's a couple additional forms of rivalry which go a little bit beyond the scope of what we are discussing today, but there's an arch rival, which out of a field of rivals would be the one that's most prominent. So Amy used the example of the quote unquote America's team. So every team loves to go up against those America's teams and prove that they're not. But you know, in the instance of the New York Yankees, obviously the Boston Red Sox are probably identified as their principal arch rival. And then you have a friendly rival, which is there's competition, but there's really no animus or ill will between the parties. It's simply recreational, just for fun or some additional benefit. So some notable non-sports rivalries, and this may surprise some people, but we have Nike and Reebok here in the United States, but Adidas and Puma really split families in Europe to the extent of that you could see in the United States Civil War era. The loyalties were so deeply embedded. And of course, Coke and Pepsi, Microsoft and Apple, Kellogg's versus Post, but also Kellogg versus Kellogg. The two brothers did not get along. And Ford versus Chevrolet are some easy examples of some really intense rivalries that are not necessarily sports-based. Sports rivalries, as I kind of alluded to, really tended to coincide with the industrial era in some respects, and really kind of emerged from those personal and geographic ties. They're most likely to develop among parties that are geographically close, have the opportunity to compete regularly, especially for the same goal or objective or prize, and then also tend to be fairly evenly matched. So what are some other sports rivalries? And you can post some comments in the chat as well that you can name off the top of your head.
Oh. There's a lot. The ones I'm most familiar with are football, obviously. I mean, it's besides the Packers and the Vikings, there's also the Packers and the Bears. That's a big one.
Okay, yep, that we see that one come across on chat as well, Bears, Packers. We also have a late vote for the Springfield Isotopes as favorite sports team.
And of course, around here, the Cubs and the Cardinals.
Sure, yeah, Cubs, Cardinals, Bulls, Knicks, Bears, Packers, Missouri, Kansas. Oh yeah, that's a big one.
Oh,
And that
yeah.
has its roots in the U.S. Civil War too. That has its roots in the fight over slavery. So that's a very intense one. It seems trivial to people today, especially because in football, they're usually not super great teams, and but it's still a very intense rivalry because of those long-standing.
There's
Both
also those
allegiances
kind
and
of
culture.
odd ones, the crosstown rivalries. I'm thinking the Mets and the Yankees.
Padres, Mets, Yankees.
Right,
Yeah.
even though the Mets and the Yankees aren't in the same league,
Mhm.
it's a big rivalry, and the Sox and the Cubs too, in that respect.
Yeah, and in the National League too, just because of longevity, like the Cubs and the Dodgers, they've played just about as many times as the Cubs and the Reds over the years, which is literally in the thousands, and it's a pretty evenly split series when you count up the wins. So maybe we have a vote for the Dodgers and Padres on the chat as well. All great suggestions and comments and thoughts there in terms of rivalries there. So thank you for that. So some other notable world rivalries that you might see in sport. So one big one in soccer is what they call the El Clasico, and that's between Barcelona and Real Madrid. And Spain and Italy, principally among the European countries. There may be some other examples there too, but their identities, even though through the rise of nationalism, they were nation states, their internal identities were still very regional and sectionalized. And there also deals with issues of class, especially in Spain here. So Barcelona is really seen as a working individuals club. And Real Madrid, anytime you see Real and the name of a Spanish-oriented soccer club, it's usually an indication of royalty or one class kind of asserting its identity over others. And so as you can see, that will create its own natural tensions there. So it had its roots in social class structure, but also in geography as well. In England, you see Millwall and West Ham. Now, this one's particularly interesting because neither of them are what we consider super big clubs by today's standards. But really, these clubs were essentially next door neighbors in terms of industrial businesses competing for the same business, market share, et cetera. And they started sports teams, and originally what started as friendly competition eventually kind of took on its own negative tensions. And eventually the clubs moved physically further away from one another, but they're still seen as very, very bitter rivals. And even though West Ham, who has enjoyed a much higher level of success historically, especially in modern history over Millwall, their competitive disparity resulted in them not even playing each other in the 1960s. But by the 1970s, they were among the most violent sports rivalries in world history. So even though they hadn't had any direct competition for over a decade, those loyalties and tensions were still there. And then you get into issues at the national level too. So Argentina and England, especially in the wake of the Falklands War in the early 1980s, that has deep standing roots in geopolitical history. And then on the individual level, there's Brian Clough versus Don Revie, who were both English soccer managers, and both really tops at what they did. But Brian Clough was so personally engaged in improving on everything Don Revie did that he actually took over the same club and unintentionally, but through his own stubbornness, drove it into the ground in just a matter of 50 days or less. And every club that Clough has managed in his career, he passed away in 2006, thereabouts. And any club that Don Revie was associated with are now still viewed as major rivals in club soccer. And of course, as we discussed, there's a lot of notable American sports rivalries too across the collegiate and professional spectrum. So we talked about the Red Sox, Yankees, Cubs, Cardinals. A big one is the Lakers versus Celtics. And that one's really interesting. The series itself was controversial because of the quality of truth in it may not have been great, but their HBO had a series called Winning Time, which really shows the disparity between the two clubs and the outsider status that the Lakers had in the NBA community and trying to get up to a competitive level. So it's an interesting series to watch from that standpoint. And of course, the Bears Packers. In college, you see Duke versus UNC, Notre Dame versus USC and versus Miami, the big Catholics versus convicts. That terminology says it all. And of course, Michigan versus Ohio State, and I can go on and on there. And you see some other geopolitical conflicts or issues where you can see. So Israel, for example, even though they're kind of on the Asian subcontinent, they do participate in UEFA competitions, and that's primarily so they don't have to go up against a lot of the Arab states in competition and create problems there. And of course, Russia and Belarus have been on the outside looking in and banned from many competitions recently, although Belarus has been allowed to participate in qualification for the next big Euro soccer tournament. And then the last bullet point here lists just a range of different pairings that were prohibited from taking place during qualification, but in the final tournament, they still could take place, but they would be taking place on a neutral field in a different country where the likelihood of conflict or problems could be minimal.
And hopefully by 2024, a lot of these problems will be worked out.
Right, exactly, yeah. So there's been some research that's been done on how do we kind of remove ourselves from those deeply held thought processes and attitudes. And so some interesting research has taken place, and this is highlighted in the book, our one book, one college selection, Think Again by Adam Grant. So some of the research started with how do you humanize the rival? And so one of the studies that was done was they looked at some Ohio State students, and they offered to pay them if they were to either cheat or lie to someone from another school. And what they found was if there was an incentive there, they would double their likelihood of lying to someone from another school. But when it came to their chief rival, Michigan, it would quadruple. And then there's the famous hot dog sandwich survey, which people were willing to sacrifice $1 to ensure that their attitude on it would win and to assert their rightness. And then they did another interesting study. These are all different groups doing these studies, but they did a study with some Manchester United fans, and they had them write, and then they simulated an emergency scenario. And what they found was that if the group of people that wrote about how much they loved their team, when the emergency scenario arose, only 30% were willing to help the victim. But when they wrote about the game in general or the commonalities that they may have with other fan bases, that number jumped to 70%. So Adam Grant, the author of Think Again, and his grad assistant, Tim Kundrow, they came up with several hypotheses, because what they found is that many of these approaches didn't seem to diffuse the attitudes between the Yankees and the Red Sox fan bases. And so they developed 3 hypotheses to kind of pinpoint what might work. And so they came up with these 3 categories. So not our hypotheses, not a league of their own, which explored what fan bases may have in common with one another. So again, we mentioned with the Yankees and the Red Sox fan bases that didn't really track with them or make any kind of inroads. And then they tried empathy, which they call feeling for our foes. And this is where they kind of did the writing about and trying to associate, what they love about their fan and try to put it in that perspective in the place of a fan from another team. And that really didn't stick as well. So lastly, what they came up with was beasts of habit. And so they're looking at the ritual aspects of it. So what they found is that, it kind of ties into commonality a little bit, but it's different because it's shared experiences, and it's looking at, they looked at a writing example specifically of a gentleman that wrote, he was a Yankees fan, and this Red Sox fan looking at this, he wrote about how much he loved the game, and he harkened back to childhood memories playing catch with his grandfather. And the Red Sox fans, many of them saw that writing and said, I still don't like him because he's a Yankees fan, but I understand where he's coming from, and it's nice to know there's at least one of them. And so that was the moment where they were able to make that connection and pinpointed that, and were able to work towards bridging those differences. So they developed what they called the arbitrariness experiment. And this is where they looked at focusing on the positive aspects of rivals. So finding that those instances like the example just provided. And what the study did is they did a couple of things. So they, let me get my notes here real quick. So they offered an incentive, but what they did is they tried to get the thinking process going with these individuals, and they gave them the opportunity to, for the other fan base, they were gonna do two things. They were gonna do a timed test, and they also were kind of tricked into being given a voice in thinking they were being given a voice and what kind of hot sauce would be served in the other team's stadium. And so they were doing a couple of different assessments there. So they were looking at, would you disadvantage the fan base in any way? Would you disadvantage an individual? And what they found was that the Red Sox fan base, when given those opportunities, did take a step back and rethought whether or not they would disadvantage the others in that instance. And so it demonstrated that they would be less willing to disadvantage those groups or individuals in those situations. So how do we get away from those attitudes, and how do we kind of put this into practice? And so they highlight what they call the stereotype timeline. And that is, the first step is having an experience. So the example they give is a kid with the mohawk stole my bike. Then you form a stereotype, which kids with mohawks are thieves, because that's the only experience you have. But then number 3 is having a new experience. So a kid with the mohawk was nice to me. Then 4 is questioning the stereotypes. So maybe mohawk kids aren't so bad because you had that positive experience. And then 5, questioning stereotypes in general, and know that you can't judge a book or kid by his cover. So how can you apply this beyond sports? So in this chapter, they look at a story of a white supremacist who was kind of taken aback at the fact that an African-American pianist could play country music on the piano so well. And they sat down and they kind of struck up a friendship, and through time, they continued to communicate and engage with one another, and they were able to, the white supremacist was able to convince friends and fellow KKK members to withdraw from the club and really reassess and change their way of thinking across the board. But one of the quotes that's directly from the individual that was the pianist said, "How can you hate me when you don't even know me?" And so, you know, when you look at the rivalries that we hold in our hearts in the athletic arena, you know, we've kind of looked at some of the triviality of it, but where some of those roots may lie. And when you take the time to kind of reassess where those attitudes are coming from and can kind of put it in a greater or global context. And another example too about removing yourself from a local community and think globally. So another example that they provide in this book chapter is they talk about astronauts and the reactions that they have the first time they see Earth from space, and how it totally changes their perception of everything. Not just at a global level, but at a personal level as well. And when they stop and realize how small and fragile but everybody else is as well.
Shatner had that response.
Yeah, that's a good example too. Yeah.
William Shatner just had that response, and then when he went up to space, and he didn't even go up that high, but he was able to see the world from a new way, and it just made him, just totally changed him. Kind of impressed him, according to him.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, and now we found out this morning that there's an asteroid that's been called what they call a planet killer asteroid that we hadn't seen, and it just appeared from behind the sun now. So, you know, it doesn't affect us for a couple hundred years, but just that puts fragility into context as well.
Yeah, no kidding.
And so just another quick shout out too. So our selection for One Book, One College is Think Again by Adam Grant. This is just kind of one snapshot of what the book's about, rethinking how we think about different things. taking a step back, reassessing ourselves, but critical thinking and opening our ways, new ways of thinking. And so you can check it out through the ICC libraries. We have physical copies as well as it's available electronically through our Overdrive or Libby collection. So if you're interested in getting access to a copy and not sure how, you can inquire at ICC libraries. And keep an eye open because we'll be probably still coming out with our 2023-2024 selection in the not too distant future. We usually make our selection, I think, in December.
Something like that.
And then we'll
Announce it in
start,
January.
yeah, and then we start promoting it either right around the holiday or when we come back in January. So be on the lookout there. And I want to thank Amy and the rest of the One Book One College Committee for having me present today. And I hope I didn't put everybody to sleep online. If you have any questions or thoughts or observations online, before we wrap things up, I'd be happy to see those. Otherwise, I thank you all for your time and attention online, and thank you for attending today.
Any questions? Oh, it's like-
Yeah, and yeah, if you're doing, yep, okay, perfect. I was gonna say, if you're looking for how to get extra credit, that's in the instructions are in the chat there, but it looks like you saw that, so.
Okay.
Okay.
So.
Oh,
Okay.
okay. Hi, Kristen and Liz. Thank you for attending. All right.
Well, if nobody has any questions, we'll go ahead and stop the recording then. If I can find